Welcome back. It's been a while. I know. We've been working out the whole time, but some of these things take time and aren't necessarily worth a full update until we complete something. So today we're going to go over some of that. And there's going to be some time travel involved because this is a project or an aspect of this car I've been working on throughout the entire process. So some of it's before the cage, some of it's before we did any chassis work, and some of it we just wrapped up now. So that's kind of the way things need to go sometimes, depending on how you're designing your parts or what the car's use is, and what works best for you. So for me, we're going to tackle the rear suspension in this video. So you're going to see earlier on, basically when we started this project, and wrapping up some of it now. We're going to go from the torsion bar rear suspension to these big Bilstein remote reservoir coilovers for the rear suspension. So it's a huge upgrade. We changed a bunch of stuff and it took some time. All right, for this project, the factory rear suspension would be a weak point, so we're going to do some upgrades. The factory car is a torsion bar setup with a small shock absorber. We're going to overwhelm both those as well as the bushings, so we're going to revamp everything. I'm going to design everything to work with this much larger 8-inch travel Bilstein remote reservoir coilover. One of the key benefits to this is the extra thermal capacity with the remote reservoir. We can adjust our spring rates a lot more accurately and control different ramp rates with this dual rate slider. So we can have a different spring top and bottom, and then we can control where this bottoms out so we can increase the ramp rate at a certain amount of travel. So we're just going to try to make the back of the car rugged enough to handle and really utilize this big of a shock. Figured we'd go through a bit of the process here. You saw me scanning before. Once I got all my scan data, I brought it into this software we use, which is Polyworks. I aligned everything, all my different positions. This is like the control arm at full compression. This is the control arm at full droop. And then I was able to kind of extract different features. So like this is the pivot point of the shock up here. And this is the lower pivot point, and then I could measure the distance between them, see what it was before at full compression with the old shock. And then I know the dimensions of my new shock. So I wanted to have full compression, full extension, kind of a baseline of where that was. And then I made some planes for different areas where I thought I might be putting some plates in to mount the shocks. So I just created a couple features there to align stuff. So I made a little kind of quick version of the shock just for dimensions. I have two in here, as you can see. One is for full compression, which is with the control arm here. So I know the length from playing with the shock. So that's where it'll line up at full compression. And then with the control arm at full droop, that's this point over here, it'll swing that far forward. So that way I know I'll have space one way or the other. The main thing that's in the way, this is one of the subframe mounts here. So at like the very full compression, it'll be just kind of touching. So I can trim this a little bit and make sure I have space. Then this is how much space I need from inside the car. I'm going to plate both sides of it. This is like the chassis rail on this outside edge here. So that'll be nice and strong. I can kind of tie into that on the inside. The other thing I'm trying to avoid is this purple smudge here is the lip of the gas tank. So the hose for my shock has to sneak past the gas tank, and I don't want to cut into it right now. So I'm trying to stay in front of the gas tank, leave space for the hose and everything over there, and kind of not cut too far into the car. Try to minimize that. So I've made these little plates here. I keyed everything together nice. So I'm gonna have these cut out by a friend of mine with a plasma table. So you can cut out little windows in them so that when I get all the pieces here, they align and click together nice. And then I can tack them all, set them in the car, and then weld them all together nice. So, same with this kind of brace between the two. This is just sheet metal here, so I wanted a little more support for this outer edge. So it's just kind of a sheet metal brace, but since it's being plasma cut, I can cut out some little windows, keep the weight down, and it'll give me some nice areas to kind of stitch weld into the body with. So now we have the actual tangible pieces cut out from my buddy's smoke wrench. So the next hurdle was cutting out the floor here. So this is one side I tacked up, well, mostly welded up now, but I had it just tacked up. It was the flat pieces I got, and then a sleeve here, and then another little support. So I still have to do that for this passenger side here. But the driver's side is welded up. I kind of just roughed my way in so that this fits pretty nice. I still have a little bit to trim on the inside, but I wanted to leave a little space so I have something nice to weld to. So I had to cut out the old shock mount that was inside this frame rail here, and then kind of clean off all the undercoating, which is still a bunch to do. But I just cut this side out last night. So we're going to do the same thing again, where I end up tacking one up and then kind of get it to fit this piece nice. Then this brace goes between the two here to strengthen it. And then once I can kind of throw the shocks in, I can start figuring out my plates for the top of this. I didn't bother modeling those just in case. Basically the hose for the remote reservoir, those big Bilstein shocks, needs to go somewhere. I haven't decided if I want it to go out the front yet or out the back. It does have enough space for the fuel tank, but depends on what other things I have in here. So I can currently flip it either way and leave space for that reservoir tube. So the next hurdle, once this stuff is all tacked in, is playing with the lower mount for the rear shocks. So I got to change the way that sits on the control arm. I didn't model anything up there. Probably won't. Probably just going to wing it. But it's a lot more straightforward than this. Yeah, everything's tacked in, a little more than tacked in. I kind of get carried away welding. But the upper mounts that I designed are in. Shocks hanging in there at the moment. I needed to throw the perch on and then start redoing these lower control arm mounts here, because I have a much bigger spring that needs to fit. So I'm probably gonna have to notch the control arm a little bit. And then I want these to be quite a bit stronger than these stamped steel stuff. But in order to figure out where that needs to be, I had to throw the trans back in, and then I got to throw an axle shaft back in to make sure I have space for the spring between the axle, and then see how far I can get into the control arm. Got it. My fear, I think I'm gonna have to notch this control arm a little bit, because when this goes up all the way, it moves forward a little bit. So I feel like the axle has a chance to get into here with the pivot point being so low. You don't want it, if you have it too high in relation to the wheel, it starts to like get towards the center line of the pivot. So you start to lose the motion ratio of the shock. So like, you know, the top of the shock doesn't move and the pivot point of the control arm doesn't move, just the lower shock and where it beats the control arm moves. So if you have it mounted like this, the more it compresses it gets to this point where it wants to like over center and you start to lose control. And that's where you want it to get stiffer, and this makes it softer. So if you move it lower, it'll keep getting stiffer up to the halfway point, which is about where fully compressed is about perpendicular. That's kind of how you want to set it up. That way, you know, the only times you should be compressing the shock that much are at a huge impact. So you want it to be stiffer there. And yeah, the motion ratio of the shock will move the shock shaft a little bit further at those fully compressed points than when it's at droop where it doesn't matter. For rally stuff, I'm not going through deep ruts or anything like that. I am going to box them in with some pretty heavy stuff, and that's only because like all the stuff getting kicked up off the front tires can kick up big rocks and everything like that. That might hit it, but it's not going to hit a stationary object in the trail or something. Not super keen on this.
Will that weaken the control arm?
Yes.
Mm.
Quite a bit, actually.
Are you going to reinforce it or not?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I don't know how yet, but it's going to have to happen. Still gonna figure out this whole boxing things in bit separate. I want to plate all this, but I want some of the interior stuff done before I do that. Because for all I know, I can flip this right now the other direction and have the resi tube go that way. But right now, it's looking like if I were able to mount it here, that'd be perfect. But for all I know, you know, a cage tube's coming down here for the down bars from the B-pillar. So whether I can put it on a tube and that keeps it out of harm's way nice, whatever, I'm not sure yet. So I'm leaving that apart for now, but you know, all the mounting points are figured out. I've now figured out the rear shock mounts, the lowers. As you can see, I cut a big hole in the control arm for the spring. They're pretty much in the same location as the stock ones, which did this, more or less. A little lower, but so I'm not worried about dragging these. The tires here, this isn't a rock crawler. I'm not going to be smashing these off stuff, but they are rugged enough. It's all 3/16 plate. I had a notch for the spring so that at full droop, it has some space. I am going to plate all that in, and I am going to reinforce the control arm because obviously cutting a big hole in it made it a lot weaker. But I'm going to wait till it's off the car before doing that. So there's tons of space here, but when it's at full compression, that's when it's a problem. Now that I have the spring on, we can't go to full compression. So this is the rear subframe and control arm from the 944. These are a torsion bar rear suspension. So there's this rod, which is splined on both halves, and it's splined in the center section, and then to the control arm out here, and that's what your spring is. So it had a shock point before, and this was your spring. These are not that adjustable, and for the amount of travel and abuse I'm going to put this car through, I don't want the torsion bars. So you saw we already cut out the rear floor of the car and made mounts for the nice big Bilstein remote reservoir coilovers, and I kind of figured out my position on the control arm for where those needed to mount. Now I got to revamp all this stuff to make it so to hold up and kind of refresh it all at the same time. There's rubber bushings in both these locations. So I'm converting everything to a monoball style like we do with a lot of our control arm kits here. So this is the end of the subframe we're talking about. This is the bore where the bushing rides factory. So this is rubber bushing here that's bonded onto this one part of the control arm. This is separate so that it's adjustable. You can twist it one way or the other, and that's how you adjust ride height with the torsion bars. So all that's going away essentially because now we're going to be cycling 8 inches of travel at the shock versus before you get like 6 realistically, and you never saw that on pavement, nor did it cycle frequently. So this car going through dirt roads and bumps and everything, it's going to cycle a lot more suspension travel, a lot more frequently and faster. So this bushing is not going to live very long at all. Also, it deflects a ton. So I've noticed it before playing with the car, like the toe change on and off throttle was pretty dramatic. You could see it on the dyno because it would deflect both these bushings pretty heavily. So we're going to convert everything over to a solid spherical monoball, and it'll be a lot more accurate, it'll live a lot longer, and I shouldn't have to maintain it ever again. So this is the outer control arm mount here, and that's what had the spline portion for the torsion bar. So I cut that off, chucked this up in the lathe, and bored the center out. So now I could press a monoball into here, and that'll take care of this outer location on the arm, but I need somewhere for it to mount because it was just a rubber bushing in this bore. So I turned up a little disc here with some threads on it and a welded nut. I'm going to weld that into the end of the tube here. It locates really nice. This is the end of the subframe. It's an aluminum piece that bolts on here. This part has a rubber bushing that I'm going to replace and mount to the car there. And there was a rubber bushing here like this. That's pretty old and decrepit by now. So I turned some little Delrin inserts here, so it'll be pretty much a solid bushing. This will press into either side here and locate into the body of the car. So the inner control arm mount was just a pair of rubber bushings. So those aren't going to hold up for what I want to do, especially throughout all the travel we're going to get. So I chucked this up in the mill, kind of fixtured it in, and then bored this out for this monoball. So that'll press into this location, which just leaves, we got to reinforce the control arm here because I had to take this big notch out for the coilover spring at full droop. So we're going to plate this in. I'm in the process of cutting some plates to box in the backside of the control arm and re-strengthen it back up. So we'll have a nice, hopefully, bulletproof setup for the back of the car. So for the rear suspension on this, we've gone from just a single small shock mount here, and it was a torsion bar setup, to now a fully adjustable coilover setup. We've made mounts here, we've boxed in and strengthened the control arm. I cut out the floor, made all sorts of reinforcements and everything to bring a much larger off-road capable shock into the cabin, and so I could cycle the full travel. So this should make a huge difference on this car because the rear suspension on the 944 is kind of a weak link for doing rally things. So that wraps up the redesign of the rear suspension on this car. Next up, we're going to dive into wiring. Wiring is something that takes quite a bit of time, and that's kind of where we are right now. So follow along. I'm excited to potentially make noise next time. You can follow me at Mike the Day on Instagram, and we're trying to really ramp up these projects, so please like and subscribe.
We should look into that.